Hello, my name is Barlog-Mitmanska and I work at the National Museum of Agriculture and Food Industry in Śreniawa. In this video I would like to present the topic Enslaved, memoirs of farm workers from 1900-1950 based on the materials collected in the scientific archives of the National Museum of Agriculture and Food Industry in Śreniawa. In Poland, the enfranchisement of peasants took place in the second half of the 19th century. But landowners were still used to the old customs and treated the workers working on their estates as feudal peasants. There was a conviction that peasants were destined to work hard for the benefit of their lords. Landlords used violence against them and their rights were not respected. As a result, it was the group with the lowest social position. The material in the scientific archive of the museum in Śreniawa allow us to look at this problem from the perspective of farm workers. In their memoir, we can observe how difficult a path they had to take to become aware of their own dignity and to fight for their rights. This evolution turned the passive peasants into conscientious citizens. Memoirs and experience of peasants are missing from literature and historiography. The historiography was created by privileged people. Today, we do not think of the history of the peasantry as our own history, but it must be remembered that in the interwar period, most Polish inhabitants lived and worked in the countryside. In 1921, peasants in Poland constitute about 75% of the total population. The unwritten history of peasants does not fit in our collective social memory either. Today, we lack a relationship with our ancestors. We do not know our roots. The acquisition of literacy was of great importance for this group. In the 18th century, the illiterate constitute over 19% of society. This percentage began to decrease in the 19th century. The illiterate peasants did not leave their journals or diaries, and they often did not have any other documents apart from their birth certificate. Finally, the ability to write allowed them to speak audibly for generations to come. Socialist agitators influenced the activation, also in writing, of this group. They strengthened peasants' faith in their value and the right to a decent life by encouraging them to rebel against the social order. Already at the time of its establishment, the Agricultural Museum in Śreniawa was obligated to cooperate with the Agricultural Workers' Union. Therefore, the museum received documents related to activities of the union. Resulting from the statutory activity of the museum, family documents and souvenirs related with life in the countryside were also sent there. There are also in the museum materials sent to the competition from a farmhand to a co-host, organized by the newspaper Agricultural Worker. They require a critical approach. This newspaper was a body of the Ministry of Agricultural Farms and the Union of Agricultural Workers, which were part of the socialist land reform of 1944. Very important is the internal motivation of the authors and the reason why they decide to write down and send their memoir. What prompted them was certainly the desire to win award, expect to be published, but it was also the opportunity to participate in the construction of ideas about the past. For this reason, the criterion of the credibility and value of memoirs may be the desire to present the past times and an honest description of the author's subjective experience. An interesting fact is that the archival documents from the editorial office of Agricultural Worker have been corrected. Sometimes these are stylistic notes, but sometimes a large section has been removed. Are they concerns not very interesting or incompatible with the policy of the Socialist Party? These materials are an excellent source of information about how the peasants perceive their place in the world, how they relate to the role assigned to them, how they justify the necessity to acquire rights and their new position in the new reality, how they perceive their personal rights and how much they were able to endure before fighting for them. The process of the feudalization of village life began in Poland in the second half of the 19th century, when Poland was partitioned. Enfranchisement, granting the peasants ownership of their land, began in 1984. Of course, the occupiers were guided not by the prosperity of the peasants, but by the fear of strikes and revolution, similar to the revolution in France or the rebellion of Galicia. Despite this, the elites continued to defend the old system. Despite the rights obtained, peasants working on the land estates were often treated inhumanely. The peasants had no legal means to enforce their rights. According to the Act of 1854, people working in agriculture were forbidden to make any collusion aimed at forcing employers to raise wages. This was the case until November 13, 1904, when the Polish People's Union was established. The first political peasant group in the Kingdom of Poland, whose aim was to defend the economic interest of all agricultural workers. The manifesto of the Union is a strong testimony to the birth of the political and national conscience of the peasants. During this period, the Polish political scene was born, with a model of participating in political life through parties. Demonstrations, strikes and protests testify to the difficult condition in which agricultural workers exist. Ultimately, the strikes led to the fact that in 1918, after independence, it was unthinkable to bypass the demands of the working class. The creation of workers' associations made it possible to regulate working conditions and wages. The gentry considered themselves only as a state and a nation. Based on the poverty of the peasant, various characteristics were attributed to them, such as laziness, low living needs, and mental deficiencies. There was a conviction among the gentry that the peasants are only capable of manual labor, and even then they had to be forced to do so because they were accused of laziness and theft. Even the agrarian reformers saw the peasants as incapable of self-determination and self-organization of work. The gentry presented themselves as a defender who must decide for the peasants, carefully controlling them and fighting their inherent evil. Exploitation was presented as beneficial for both groups. Work relationships have been compared to family relationships in which each group, being dependent, cared for the other. Peasants were employed in the so-called ordinaria. For their works they received grain, a piece of land, wood, a flat, and the possibility of keeping a cow, for example. Work was performed 5 days a week from dawn to dusk. Overtime was not paid. If the peasant had a wife, she also had to work, otherwise they would not receive full payment. Sometimes he had to provide a journeyman. It could have been a child. These people did not enter into an employment relationship with the landlord. Mother did not have time to look after their children. Older children did that. Very often, the salary agreed with the employers was not received. After the creation of professional organization, the situation of agricultural workers changed. After the 1922-23 strikes initiated by the Agricultural Workers Union, it was agreed that the working day would last from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. There were agreed breaks for breakfast and afternoon tea of 30 minutes and a lunch break of 1.5 hours. The landlords lacked empathy for the peasants. They often treated them like animals. The criterion of value on the farm was productivity, which determined the value of both livestock and employees. As long as a man was fit for work, he was valuable. When he could not work, reasons were sought to remove him and his family from the estate. Efficiency was perhaps the only aspect that would have saved the worker from imprisonment or physical punishment that would exclude him from work, depriving the landlord of a cheap workforce. Violence was considered the norm. It was used as a punishment, but it was also a form of motivating employer. The apartments offered by landlords were far from the basic sanitary standards known to us. In an apartment for 15 to 18 people, there was often only one room, no floor, and often only one small window. Every year, there was a shortage of food in the pre-harvest season. The law on health insurance for farm workers and their families entered into force on January 1st, 1940. But the gentry believed that it was too expensive for them and interfered too much with existing patriarchal relations. There was an obligation to ensure the employee at the health fund. It was also a type of retirement or disability insurance. The contributions were to be paid in half by the landlord and the worker. However, the implementation of the agreement was unsuccessful for the employer. The first protest against employers took place as early as 1904. At that time, groups demanding better living conditions and shorter working time walked around the villages. Workers associated in the unions from the turn of 1918-1919 were guaranteed benefits, the conclusion of a collective agreement between the employers and the union. Employers were not allowed to change tariffs and members also acquired certain social rights. However, the gentry class tried to cancel these privileges. During the strikes, people fought for guaranteed collective agreements, specific working hour, appropriate rates, pensions, and the right to purchase plots in the event of a parcelation. Some of the strikes were bloody, as in 1922, when a strike broke out in the Shamotuły district during the harvest season. Similar events took place in many estates. The Union of the Landlords, led by Edward Potworowski, ruthlessly rejected the demands of the workers. Peasants freed themselves from social and intellectual slavery in small steps, wresting from the hands of employers human and labor rights and privileges. The memoirs were written ex post, and many details could have faded from memory. However, these people, authors, are not lonely individuals. They are members of a wider community. They build their knowledge about the world not only based on their own memories, but also based on collective and social memory. Memoirs reveal the social and historical reality, the meaning attributed to the events and the perception of agricultural workers about their own past, often known only from their parents and grandparents. This period is specific because it is a time of social change caused by the two world wars and the activity of socialists. Memoirs reflect what was considered important: life choices, the struggle for workers' rights, the emergence of a new social order. The memoirs and memories of the years of hardship and unjustified sufferings and punishments were a tool for the farm workers to legitimize their new place in the social hierarchy.